Here to introduce Professor Wang is Dean John Lee of International and Area Studies. Dean Lee.
Hope you're enjoying your lunch. It's my great honor to introduce Professor Ling Chi Wang, who, as Camille said, just retired from many years, many decades, I believe 4 decades of teaching at UC Berkeley. Ling Chi is, as many of you know, a very, very remarkable individual and a very distinguished scholar and educator. He was born in Xiamen, used to be known as Amoy, in Fujian province, which I had a great privilege of visiting several months ago. Apparently he's thinking of buying a condo there. I guess one wants to return. It's a beautiful harbor city, as you know. And as an undergraduate, I think he studied music. And being kind of a diasporic, kind of a wandering type of fellow, he then went on to study Near Eastern languages, where he received his degrees. But not being content with music and Middle Eastern languages, he became very active in Asian American civil rights movement in the 1960s and has been professor teaching Asian American history, Asian American civil rights, and Asian American studies for roughly 4 decades, and has been a pioneer in each of these fields. Asian American history or Asian American studies as such really didn't exist before Ling Chi and his colleagues came on, and he's done really a wonderful and distinguished role as the pioneer in these areas of study, producing many PhDs who have become in turn leaders in these fields. He's also a very well-known activist on behalf of Asian Americans in particular and of all Americans in general, especially on civil rights issues. And so it's a great privilege for us to hear Ling Chi's disquisition on teaching of Chinese language. As many of you know, he was very active in promoting the instruction of Chinese language and is usually credited with having SAT 2 include Chinese as the first Asian language to be part of the SAT exam. The title of his talk is Beyond Fad and Fetishism, Necessity and Chauvinism. Please welcome Ling Chi.
Thank you very much, Dean John Lee. Let me first thank the Berkeley China Initiative and Dean Lee for, first of all, for organizing this forum, and then for inviting me to share with you some of my thoughts on the subject matter. But before I begin, I also would like to register a disclaimer. You know, when it comes to teaching and learning Chinese, I am strictly an amateur, okay? Because I neither teach Chinese, nor do I do research on Chinese language. I can talk a lot about the ancient Middle Eastern languages, but definitely not Chinese. You know, and all of you here are really experts on the subject, especially those affiliated with our Department of East Asian Languages and the Graduate School of Education. I am instead really a historian of Asian America and also a student of public policy, especially in the area of language and educational policies. And that's where actually my presentation is based largely on my experience of working on these issues in the last 40 years. What we are discussing today, of course, is a very timely and urgent issue facing the United States in general and education in particular. How do we understand and engage China as an emerging global power, and what should be taught in our schools to better prepare our children for a world in which the United States and China will play dominant roles in the 21st century, demonizing or scapegoating impotent China and helpless Chinese American minority without basis may be a proven and convenient tool for partisan power, political power struggles among politicians in election years in this country in the past, the time for returning to draw water from the same well may very well be over, and inflaming the gullible public with the alleged threat of China and the vulnerable Chinese American minorities may no longer serve partisan politics well, and most certainly not our national interests. And unfortunately, this has been the history, I think, of America's dealing with China and also its treatment of the Chinese minorities here. Understanding China through teaching and learning Chinese language and culture is more civil and certainly more enlightened approach. In fact, the approach of late has become both a fad and a necessity, as we have been hearing this morning, especially with our opening keynote speaker. America seems to have discovered China anew, as we previously did on several occasions. For instance, we realized the importance of China trade immediately after the American Revolution, the strategic advantages of an open-door policy toward China in late 19th century, and of forming a convenient military alliance with the Chiang Kai-shek regime during and immediately after the Second World War. The power of merging yellow peril and red scare during the Cold War period, is really a rare combination of yellow peril and red scare, in terms of our formulating our policy toward China, and the usefulness of strategic engagement with China through Nixon's historic meeting with Mao Zedong in 1972, and finally the economic and geopolitical importance of China's rise since 1990s. I hope that the latest round of popular discovery of China and the passion for learning Chinese will yield lasting mutual respect and benefits for both China and the United States, and for that matter, for the rest of the world. So let me just begin by highlighting some of the examples of the current interest in Chinese language education. And don't forget, not only in the United States, but also in China as well. There's always that other side that we sometimes tend to overlook. So let me cite some examples from the United States and then some examples from China to show how the current situation is in terms of opportunity for teaching and learning Chinese. On January 11 this year, the New York Times published an article entitled, "Another Chinese Export is All the Rage, China's Language." That's the headline in the New York Times. The reporter wrote, "For decades, people in China's neighboring countries have viewed China with deep suspicion. But now, mastering Chinese as a door to lucrative business opportunities, or simply as a matter of popular fashion, is suddenly all the vogue, not only there, but in the United States and Europe as well." End of quote. That's an item from the New York Times. And New York Times, those of you who read it regularly know that tend to report only the bad news about China. Never really anything positive. And this is one of those rare occasions that the New York Times actually has something positive to say. But it has to frame it in such a way that even then it's somewhat negative. Then, another example, from Falls Church and Vienna, two tiny towns in the state of Virginia, to here in the Bay Area, suburban Fremont, Union City, Hayward, San Leandro, San Lorenzo, Castro Valley, and Pleasanton, not to mention Palo Alto and Cupertino here in California. Public elementary schools are offering or are preparing to offer Chinese classes. This is rather incredible. Falls Church in Vienna, Virginia, and then all the way here along East Bay in our neighbor are all doing that. And likewise, Chinese language classes have become the most sought after foreign language classes in colleges and universities. And I think, including Berkeley, we cannot open enough Chinese classes for the number of people who will demand to get into those classes. Another example, the influential Asia Society published a report recently entitled Expanding Chinese Language Capacity in the United States. What would it take to have 5% of high school students learning Chinese by 2015? Only 5%. I mean, this is the goal. What it would take. And so the report really went on and talked about how to build infrastructure because we were so far behind. And in fact, that report reminds me of Fairbank's letter to the editor of the New York Times when Nixon came back from China in 1972, in which he bemoaned the fact how inadequate we were as a nation to prepare to deal with China because the entire China study field got wiped out during the McCarthy era. And so we really did not have people. Well, I'm sorry to say that the situation, in fact, persists to this day, even though the situation has become much better. Another example, a survey conducted by the College Board in 2005 found some 2,400 high schools in the United States interested in offering not just Chinese as a foreign language, but AP Chinese, which is going to be administered beginning next year. AP Chinese for the first time. Now, according to a study conducted by the National Council of Association of Chinese Language Schools, this is the Chinatown or Chinese American Community Schools. This was done in 1995. There were actually 5,542 teachers teaching in 634 Chinese language schools, mostly weekend schools, in 47 states in the United States, teaching some 82,000 students. These are all Chinese Americans. So clearly there's a kind of a grassroots interest out there, at least within the Chinese American population. And I'll have more to say about this point here. Let me just cite a couple more examples. I already mentioned that the College Board is going to do the AP Chinese for the first time, although I think that the initial test takers most likely will be some of those 82,000 Chinese American students, rather than in the public school, because our public school is so far behind in terms of preparing our students. Then last item, I think many of you may have heard that Senator Joe Lieberman has introduced a bill in the Senate that will appropriate, if passed, over $1 billion to basically build the infrastructure for American educational system to gear up to teach more about Chinese language and culture. So these are some of the examples of what's going on in the United States. And what about in China? We have not heard much about this in China, but let me share with you what I understand what's going on. In a headline article in the People's Daily last year, July 20th, the Chinese government jubilantly reported that 30 million persons in 100 countries are learning Chinese, and some 2,300 universities throughout the world are offering Chinese classes. That's an amazing number, 30 million. And then in a follow-up report this year, on May 23rd, the People's Daily reported that by 2010, as many as 100 million people will be learning Chinese worldwide, and to meet that demand, the world will need, get this, 5 million Chinese language teachers. Where are you going to find that? And then last year, the Chinese government reported that the number of foreign students studying Chinese in Chinese universities has increased from 41,000 in 1996 to 400,000 in 2004. And just last week, the Chinese government announced that the first time in history that there are more foreign students studying in Chinese university than China had sent out to foreign countries, which is a little bit over 100,000. So things are, and I learned from my Korean colleagues in Korea that there are 50,000 Koreans studying in China alone in Chinese university. So this is a kind of phenomenon that's going on. Another example, to meet the mounting demands for learning Chinese, the Ministry of Education is spending about $200 million a year to initiate 8 different initiatives dealing with the teaching and learning of Chinese, among which, of course, is the establishment of a chain of so-called Confucius Institutes throughout the world, something like the Alliance Française or Germany's Goethe Institute or the United Kingdom's British Council. Thus far, 75 have been established, including 4 here in the United States. The 4 are in the University of Maryland, in New York, in Chicago, and here in San Francisco at San Francisco State University. But there were other things like, in getting recruiting a number of volunteer teachers to go abroad, sort of like our Peace Corps. Except in this case, the Chinese will be sending their Peace Corps people all over the world to help teach Chinese. And of course, China has developed something called 汉语水平考试, which is really China's answer to TOEFL. That's going on. And then, of course, they've been hosting a lot of forums and conferences in China, inviting educators, teachers, school principals to go to China to get training. And then the Chinese universities are being mobilized to provide technical assistance to anywhere in the world that university or schools that needed some help. So that's what's going on over in China. In addition, last July, China actually hosted the first World Chinese Conference, to which I actually attend at the Great Hall of the People, a conference attended by some 3,000 people from all over the world, all there to talk about teaching and learning Chinese. And then just last month, about 300 representatives from Confucius Institutes from 35 countries were invited to meet in the Hall of the People, Great Hall of the People, where they share their knowledge and experience with each other and with experts in China. Also invited, of course, were hundreds of school board members, teachers, and school principals, including 5 school board members and the acting superintendent of San Francisco, which made the news this morning incredibly, as if they have committed some kind of fraud by being invited to participate in a conference on how to advance the learning and teaching of Chinese. You should take a look at that article. All that suggests that there is some problem still, in spite of all the euphoria. There's still a lot of resistance and a lot of problem with attitude, how people look at China, how people look at Chinese Americans, and how people look at the studying of Chinese language and culture. Finally, I just want to call your attention that if you subscribe to People's Daily, which I do, because this is the official Chinese language newspaper, but this is yesterday's paper. Every week there's one day, a full page devoted to the reporting of how the rest of the world are learning Chinese. It's a very instructive kind of program. And this particular issue from yesterday happens not to be that particular day where such article would appear, but it did have an article in here about learning Chinese, and which is quite interesting. About all the mad rage about learning Chinese throughout the world, and then how this is really an opportunity to promote international and racial harmony. It's a very interesting article. So this will give you an idea of the kind of perspective, I think, from China in terms of what is going on outside of China. So as educator, what are we to make of the current phenomena, both in China and the United States? I think it exposes the glaring inadequacy of our school curriculum, for one thing, and it also highlights the defects in the ongoing relations between the United States and China. That's what it is, because we have this kind of euphoria because of this kind of really woeful inadequacy in our educational system, and also the constant tension between China and the United States. So how should we deal with the sudden burst of interest in learning Chinese at the grassroots level across the United States, and the eagerness of the Chinese government in extending a helping hand in meeting the need of Chinese language education in schools in the United States and, in fact, throughout the world? Now, current American fetishism is matched only by China's stun over the unprecedented global desire to learn Chinese, sort of a 受宠若惊, a rare phenomena of, of 心慧 and of 自和, self-gratification and self-pride that can be easily, of course, transformed, and I think China has to be careful about this, into misguided egotism and nationalist chauvinism. When you read these People's Daily's article, it's sometimes it's a little bit alarming that it seems to be promoting a kind of nationalism that really ought not to be. We ought to be careful about that kind of thing. Now, as you can see, the timing of this forum could not be more favorable. There is, of course, like everything else, a Marxist saying from Marxist, 天时不如地利, 地利不如人和. Roughly, I would say, translated into, timely opportunity is not as favorable as geographic advantage, but geographic advantage is not as favorable as harmonious human relations, or what I prefer, 人和, to translate it as shared interest or common interests among people. So timeliness, geographic, so in other words, what we are now witnessing, in fact, is the convergence of 天时, 地利, and 人和. Timeliness, geographic advantage, and shared interests. Now that's a very rare combination. So we really have an unusual opportunity to do something about advancing the teaching and learning of Chinese. In short, we now have the best of all possible worlds to advance the cause of Chinese language education in California and in the United States. However, this is not about idolizing Chinese language and culture, nor is it about learning something rather useful. And I think, of course, there's nothing wrong about learning something for usefulness, like finding a job or doing better business with China, which is, of course, some of the speakers talk about this. That's all very important. But I think the real question is really, what are we doing about our educational system, our curriculum, and what are we doing in terms of reshaping international relations between the United States and China through the teaching and learning of Chinese. And so it's precisely for this reason that I gave that strange title to my talk today, to register my caution against what former Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan called irrational exuberance. On both sides of the Pacific Ocean, we have to be careful. We have to be careful about what's going on in China. We have to be careful about what's going on in the United States. And I think we need to recognize the fact that teaching and learning Chinese, as desirable as it is in America today, there are going to be a lot of obstacles and resistance and even outright hostile opposition to these efforts. And I think some of those people who spoke earlier in the morning have suggested that already. So I think one of the ways for us to approach this is, of course, to take a look at our educational system. What did we do in the past about teaching and learning Chinese? Well, let me suggest that before this current euphoria, since I trace it to the early 1990s, the teaching of Chinese, interestingly enough, really was confined to only two areas, very, very small areas. First, to the traditional sinologists in American elite universities and colleges. That's the first. And then the other is really confined to Chinatown, those community language schools that I mentioned earlier. Now then, if you take a look at the China studies that are relegated to something called the Oriental Languages Department or Oriental Studies Department, what do they do in there? Well, they basically have been doing only two things. One, they study Chinese philology. And two, they study Chinese classics in an attempt to understand Chinese culture, Chinese civilization, literature, art, and all that. In other words, the old Oriental studies or sinology really was not devoted to the teaching of a living language spoken by hundreds of millions of people. Instead, they really teach you how to look up lexicons and how to exegete a text, not how to read a newspaper or to be able to converse fluently in Chinese. That's the one problem with teaching and learning. And that has something to do, of course, with our whole attitude that, that the rest, there's nothing that we can possibly offer to America in terms of Chinese language, culture, history, and all that, because that's only relegated to some scholars who are tucked away in these remote departments in a very elite university. And the other place, as I mentioned, was in Chinatown. Historically, and by the way, my children, it's really quite amazing. I have 3 children. The first 2 were separated from the third one by almost 10 years. And, and I had a problem, same problem that was raised this morning, by Beverly and the people who got up and asked questions. How do I raise my own children? And, I did the same thing that Beverly did. I decided that we will raise our children bilingually. But in order to overcome the overwhelming power of the English language, we decided that we would not speak English at all at home. Instead, we spoke only Cantonese at home because my wife speaks Cantonese. And so all our children reported to San Francisco Public Schools kindergarten, and they were reported by the teachers that they were non-English speakers. All my children. And then also we sent them to Chinatown School. We were fortunate that we live in San Francisco, Chinatown. So they went to Chinatown School, and but not just the weekend school like those several hundred Chinese schools across the country today, where only weekends. No, every day, 2 hours a day after American public school. And as somebody was saying earlier, that they hated it. My 2 older children hated it, and that's why by the time when I had a 3rd child, I decided that, this is not going to be, I don't want to subject my 3rd child, who was 9 years younger than my 2nd one, to the same kind of, pressure. And that's why in 1983, I invited the superintendent of San Francisco Public School at that time was Robert Aliotto to my home for dinner. At that time, my wife was already pregnant with my 3rd child. And I pointed at my wife and said, that child, when he or she comes out, is not going to go through what the other 2 have gone through, the ordeals, and the resentfulness, that they had about learning Chinese. And I said, so he said, what do you want? I want Chinese to be taught in public school from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. He said that you can have it in an orderly manner. In other words, 1 year at a time, you add 1 grade at a time. But there are 2 conditions that you must meet. Number 1, that you must find enough parents interested in your crazy idea. Of course, to me, it wasn't a crazy idea. In fact, I learned it from the St. Lambert School in Montreal, Canada, that Alice talked about earlier. That's the first condition, to find enough parents that are interested in it. Secondly, which is really difficult, because San Francisco Public School at that time was under court order to integrate, but through busing. So he said that your Chinese immersion program must be racially balanced. In other words, you must have also white and black and Latino parents interested in having their kids into that program. Well, the rest is history, because we have no problem meeting those 2 conditions. And Leanna Cito was there, the very beginning of this program, which began at West Portal Elementary School, and then eventually branched out to today's Alice Fong U. And then subsequently, when my daughter finally entered the program and then graduated, I also helped establish the Chinese immersion program at Hoover Junior High, and now that same program is at Galileo High School with both Mandarin and Cantonese track. So what I'm saying is that, it's possible, but there is a lot of resistance, okay? And those schools turn out, of course, as you know, turned out to be the two schools that are now have the Chinese immersion program among the some 60 elementary schools in San Francisco happen to be the number 1 and number 2 schools in San Francisco, and there's a long waiting list forever to try to get in. I have heard so many parents complain to me about, so your children get a program like a good program like that, but how come our children can never get in? And so you know what, San Francisco is going to have a Mandarin bilingual immersion program for the first time this fall at the Star King Elementary School. So now, what I'm suggesting here is that the learning of Chinese language has been a very, very isolated and marginalized phenomenon, confined to Chinatown and to Orientalist kind of a department. And the challenge really has to do with legitimacy on the one hand, and also with the racism idea. Our educational system is completely Eurocentric. We don't realize it because we're in it. Let me give you an example. We now take it for granted that College Board offers SAT tests in China, SAT to Chinese, which began, by the way, in 1994, 95, and beginning next year it's going to be AP Chinese. We take it for granted. But you have no idea how difficult it was to try to negotiate and persuade the College Board to actually take on the development of a Chinese SAT-2 test. For that, I hosted 3 national conferences to try to persuade Don Stewart, then the president of College Board. He spoke in 2 of those conferences, and I still could not convince him. Why? Because the answer was quite simple. Show me where the interest in America is for learning Chinese. Over 98% of American public schools' foreign languages are either French, German, or Spanish, no Chinese. So why should we, College Board, develop a test for non-existing students, test takers? So in response to that, I called another conference to compile all the data on the Chinese language schools and actually other Asian languages, including Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese that I asked the College Board for. And this time I compiled all those community language schools and showed it to him that if you were to do these, there will be people taking these tests. Still not convinced. Said that, these are, we don't know about these schools. And we don't even know their standards. So we are not interested in it. So finally, it sort of dawned on me that the College Board derived its annual revenue, 10% of the annual revenue is derived from UC applicants. All of them have to take 5 SAT tests, 2 SAT-1 and 3 SAT-2. And that gave 10% of the revenue from College Board. So I went to California State Legislature, to both the Senate and the State Assembly, and asked our representative to introduce a bill in the legislature, calling on the College Board to develop SAT tests in Asian languages, and if it fails to do that in 2 years, the legislature will ask UC to stop using SAT tests altogether. You know what? The bill didn't even have to go to a hearing because College Board immediately said that let's talk. Okay, and this is why we now have SAT in Chinese and now AP Chinese. It was not easy because, again, it's really the whole attitude. And I mean, over 90% of our public schools offer foreign language, no more than French, Spanish, and German. And that's where the problem is. That's why I suggest that, all the euphoria about learning Chinese, I think we've got to face up to the fact that there is a lot of resistance. That mother who was out here asking questions, I really could feel for her because, she got turned away everywhere, And there are a lot of people, who want to learn Chinese. And the question is, how do we go about it? And I think that it's very fundamental that we, that we think about what is the purpose of our public education, or what is the purpose of liberal education in our higher education. And I think we've got to, first of all, recognize the fact that our educational system has been biased to start with, And that's why we are in a situation that we are now in. With needing 5 million Chinese teachers worldwide, or in America, we really don't have. There are, the same Asia Society report that I mentioned earlier, calling for more, aiming at 5% of high schools, in 2015 that will have Chinese learning opportunity. That same report said that there are only 4 American universities today that train, that have a credential program for Chinese. Only 4, and none of them in California. So we really have a long, long way to go. And I think one of the ways to get at it, of course, it's not that there are no talents, that can teach Chinese in America. I think the Chinese American community can offer a lot of talent. The problem is how do you deal with those policies and institutions that inhibit the opportunity of these people from becoming teachers. Now, just before, how am I doing on time? Very shortly. Okay, I need to mention, because there's a lot of misconception going on out there about learning Chinese. You have heard about bilingual education. That's almost like a curse word, right? Oh, this is un-American, this is subversive. And in fact, California went through the trouble of enacting a Proposition 227 a few years ago to ban bilingual education. Because bilingual education actually has been a very humane, very effective way of teaching new immigrants how to acquire the English language. The simple logic, your common sense will tell you that if I am 17 years old, I just come over from China or from Vietnam, and I don't know speak a word of English, and I get put into the 11th grade because I'm 17 years old. And of course, I know a lot of words, and so therefore, so you just they just send you through the system, and then you graduate. Right? Of course, now we can't do that anymore, send kids through the system. But bilingual education basically said that, okay, you're 17, obviously in China or in Vietnam, you already have some educational background. Let's take advantage of what you know already in history, in science, in math, and all other subject matter. We'll teach you so that you don't fall behind those subject matter in the language that you understand. And then we'll give you an intensive dosage of English, intensive English every day, while you are trying to try to advance through the school system. Very simple concept, and yet people consider that to be, subversive. So that, in fact, tells you something about how strong a resistance. Now, and this is why eventually, I resorted to a lawsuit that was filed in 1970 against the San Francisco Unified School District. We lost at the federal court, district court. We lost at the appellate level. But in 1974, the United States Supreme Court unanimously ruled in our favor, saying that San Francisco Unified School District had illegally discriminated against Chinese American children by not giving them an equal educational opportunity and giving them an education that is both meaningful and comprehensible to these children. In fact, the Supreme Court went as far as saying that to suggest that these immigrant children who speak no English at all were getting the same textbook, the same teacher, the same classroom facilities, everything the same, and therefore there's no discrimination against them, is in fact, according to the Supreme Court, is to make a mockery of public education. And it's this Supreme Court decision, Lau versus Nichol in 1974, that laid the foundation for bilingual education, and also the foundation actually for the development of Chinese language curriculum to go with the bilingual education. But that is very, very different from the kind of immersion program that I'm talking about, and still also very different from teaching Chinese as a foreign language. This is really what we are talking about. How do we mainstream Chinese language teaching as a foreign language in all the public schools in America? And that's what really we should be focusing on. Although I also like the fact that, and I plan to, by the way, ask the San Francisco School Board soon, as soon as I have a chance to put it down in writing and submit it to them. And it's to make San Francisco Public School the first public school system in America in which all the children from K through 12 will be offered immersion language opportunity. So as soon as a child enters the kindergarten, the parent will decide which language, second language they will take up, and that second language will stay with the child all the way to the 12th grade. And I think that, And I think we could probably, let the market forces dictate the choice of language. And I think it's going to be very clear. And in fact, I predict that by year 2050, there will be 4 major international languages in the world: English, Chinese, Spanish, and Arabic. Very few Americans realize that Arabic is used from Philippines in the east all the way to Morocco in the west. Over 30 countries use that language, and yet we are so ill-prepared. We're even worse off in Arabic than we are in Chinese. So anyway, these are just some random thoughts, and I think that what we really are talking about is, what is the purpose of education, and how do we create, how do we prepare educated people? And surely enough, in the kind of a globalized setting that we are now in, very definitely, Chinese and possibly other, certainly I think Arabic, ought to be an integral part of our public education from K through 12. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wang. That was really a wonderful inspiration and give us a terrific perspective on why we're all here to talk about Chinese language and learning. It's not merely the utilitarian value of having it be important in the marketplace, but also to create well-rounded citizens and students and teachers. I'm delighted to have the participation of KQED's Elaine Shen today, and I think you'll really enjoy what she has to present. KQED, as you probably know, is on the forefront of working in communities and with broader audiences to promote educational agendas, including learning more about Asia and Asian Americans. So we are in for a special treat with a sneak preview of a video that Elaine is here to talk with you about.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can see me. I might need a milk crate to stand on behind this podium. I'm Elaine Shen. I'm with KQED Education Network. And it's been rather exciting for me to hear everything this morning and this afternoon about Chinese language and cultural education, because I was born in Taiwan, but then I moved to Oklahoma, and then I grew up in North Carolina. So my first language was Mandarin, and then I had a very pronounced Southern accent. And then I come here to California, and people thought, oh, this is really strange, a Chinese woman with a very pronounced Southern accent. What's that about? So my language background is of another alternative there. But I wanted to tell you about this film that's coming up called China from the Inside. And what I've done is that I've distributed some postcards that we've put together for this film, and they should be on the tables there. They should look like, and John, this is the only visual that you're going to get of the film since we're not going to be able to webcast it. But they look like this, so they're little postcards, and on the back it's red, and it's terribly clever. It's perforated, so if you want more information about what we're doing around the film here at KQED, you can tear it off and give it to me. You can leave it with me. And I'll be here for about 10 minutes after I present the film, but then I have to get back to work at KQED. But yes, so if you see these postcards, please pick one up if you're interested after you watch the film. This film, called China from the Inside, is 4 hours, and it is a co-production of KQED, PBS, and the BBC, Granada Films. So it's very British in tenor, and it's a British filmmaker. He narrates most of it, and I want you to watch this small clip that I'll present today and think about it in these terms. It's not a primer about China. It is about modern-day China, but think about it in terms of how it could complement your activities in the classroom or at your institutions of learning about Chinese language and Chinese culture. And I'm so happy to hear about everyone talking about cultural education, because as we all know, those of us who have traveled abroad, it's not just the language, although that's greatly appreciated when someone speaks your language, but of course there are cultural understandings that will get us much further. So when you watch this, think about how this film can be a springboard or a catalyst to what's happening in the classrooms. And to help you think about it in those terms, at KQED Education Network, we will be rolling out 2 educator workshops, one in September and one in January. This film has been broadcast already in the UK, and it will broadcast on PBS here in the United States in January of '07. We're trying to talk to PBS about maybe looking at broadcasting it around the Lunar New Year, which might be a nice way of packaging it. And we're lucky there here at KQED because John Boland, who is our Chief Content Officer at KQED, we're sad that he's leaving, but he has a new job with PBS in DC as their new Chief Content Director. And so it's a brand new position, and it all started here in the Bay Area. How many, can I see a show of hands? How many of you use documentary film in your classrooms or in your teaching? Okay, so documentary film, not like feature films, not like, you know, showing a Zhang Yimou film or the Joy Luck Club or something, but like a documentary film, right? Okay. So that's part of the workshop that we'll be presenting on how to use documentary films using media as a springboard for education, for classroom activities, on how to build it out for interactive student learning. So I think it's queued up properly, and Anna, if we could bring down all the lights so we can see the film properly, that would be really helpful.